All right, everyone, get ready because today we're going deep, really deep into a part of American history that you might not know much about. We're going to be looking at the role of white women in slavery. And honestly, the stuff we found in our main source, the American History Hit podcast with Dr. Stephanie Jones Rogers, who wrote, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Well, it's going to really make you think twice about some of the things you thought you knew about this time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we think of a slave owner, we usually picture a man. But the truth is, women were right there, deeply involved.
I know, right? Dr. Jones Rogers says something like 40% of all the enslaved people in the South were owned by women. That's wild, almost half. That really changes how we see things, you know?
It definitely does. And what makes it even crazier is the legal side of things back then. Women in the South, before the Civil War, they had almost no rights. Couldn't vote, couldn't own property most of the time, but they could own other people.
It's like some weird legal contradiction. How does that even make sense?
Well, Dr. Jones Rogers, she says it wasn't about giving women more equality or anything like that. Instead, it was all about the men in power, the lawmakers wanting to make slavery even stronger. They saw women as a key part of keeping the whole system going and growing. It was them playing the legal system straight up.
So it's not a sign of progress for women, it's the opposite. These laws were made to make slavery worse. That's a hard thing to think about.
It is. And then you have the economic side of it, too. White women owning slaves, it gave them a lot of economic power they didn't have anywhere else in their lives.
Exactly. Sometimes they even ended up owning more than their husbands. Really flips the script on how we usually think of power back then, right? Makes you wonder how all that money played out in their lives and their relationship.
For sure. And we can't forget, slaves were given as dowries and wedding gifts. Imagine you're a young woman getting another human being as a present, basically a way to make sure you're financially secure in your marriage.
That's just messed up. It really shows how they dehumanized people back then, just saw them as things to buy and sell and make money off of. And Dr. Jones Rogers, she really pushes back against that whole kindly mistress idea we hear sometimes.
Right, she paints a very different picture. Not a comfortable one either. These women weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were making decisions, running the system, and profiting from it.
And get this. Dr. Jones Rogers says sometimes they actually had to work harder than men to get around the laws. To buy and keep slaves, I mean.
Wow. Think about that. All those legal hoops they jumped through just so they could exploit other people shows you how much they wanted to keep the system going.
A far cry from that nice mistress image, that's for sure. You know, there's the story about Martha Washington, George Washington's wife. That really gets at this point.
Oh, yeah.
So after George Washington died, Martha inherited some slaves, right? But here's the thing. In his will, George said they should be freed after Martha died. And you know what? This made Martha afraid for her own safety. Yeah, crazy, right? It's scary to think that someone so important, someone we might think had some morals about slavery, would be more worried about staying alive than doing the right thing.
That's heavy. Shows you how even people in power, even those who maybe question slavery a little, were still driven by wanting to protect themselves and their own position.
Yeah, definitely. Makes you think about the dynamics in those households where both the husband and wife owned slaves. Did they treat them differently? Did they have different ways of keeping them in line? Imagine what it must have been like for those enslaved people living under those conditions. So much we don't know.
It's true. It really makes you think. And it's important to remember that slavery, well, it wasn't the same everywhere. Conditions and treatment could be totally different, like depending on how big the plantation was, the people who owned the slaves, and what kind of work the slaves were doing.
Right, and there's that myth about the slaves who worked in the house, the so-called house slaves. Like, they had it easier, which is so not true.
Yeah, that's a dangerous idea. In reality, they were always being watched, expected to be perfect all the time, and often they were abused horribly, even sexually.
It's like just because they were closer to the people who owned them didn't mean they were safe from the cruelty and dehumanization. In some ways, it made them even more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And talking about exploitation, we can't forget about family separation. Dr. Jones Rogers talks a lot about this.
You mean using enslaved women as wet nurses? Forcing them to feed white babies while their own babies were taken away.
Exactly. This was way more common than people think.
Mm.
And the stories from the people who lived through it, especially the children who were left behind, it's heartbreaking. It shows the deep and lasting trauma of these forced separations.
I can't even imagine the pain those families went through. It's a stark reminder that white women were right there, actively part of this system. And even as slavery was coming to an end, white women fought hard to keep it alive, just like white men
Their reactions were all over the place. Denial, desperation. They tried to hide slaves, move them around, even sell them off last minute to try and hold on to their wealth. They clearly saw these people as property first and human beings second.
Some even said they'd rather die than see black people free. It shows how deeply racist and entitled they were, the whole foundation of slavery.
And the role they played in creating that lost cause narrative after the Civil War, that really proves it.
So not only were they part of the system, they also tried to control how it was remembered, tried to downplay the brutality, their own role in it.
That's right. They paid for Confederate statues, messed with school curriculums, pushed this pro-South view that basically pretended slavery wasn't that bad.
It's like they were trying to erase the evidence, make themselves look like victims, kind of like what we see today when people try to whitewash the bad parts of history.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to look at history from different angles, especially from the people who were silenced and marginalized. We need to hear their stories directly.
So after digging into all this, with Dr. Jones Rogers' research, what stands out to you the most? What was the most surprising thing?
For me, it's how far white women were willing to go to use the legal system for their own benefit. They had all these legal roadblocks in other parts of their lives, but they figured out how to work the system when it came to owning slaves.
It shows how determined they were to be part of this exploitation and to profit from it, even when they were denied basic rights themselves. It makes you question those easy stories we tell about the past, forces us to see how complicated and messy power and privilege really are.
It does, and it adds a whole new layer to how we understand slavery and its legacy. Makes us face the fact that women, even those who were denied rights themselves, could still be part of systems of oppression, even keep them going.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality has to include everyone. You can't separate women's rights from racial justice.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that slavery didn't just disappear overnight when it ended. The economic gaps, the systemic racism, the trauma that's passed down through generations, those are all echoes of that brutality shaping our world today.
This isn't just about history, it's about understanding the present, seeing how those injustices from the past are still alive in the inequality we see today. And it's about recognizing the strength and resilience of those who were enslaved.
You're right, despite all the horrors, they fought for freedom, they built families and communities, they contributed so much to American culture.
Their stories need to be heard, their experiences understood. That's the only way to truly grasp this dark part of our history.
That's what's so powerful about Dr. Jones Rogers' work. She lets the formerly enslaved tell their own stories. That's a huge change in how we studied history. For too long, the stories have been told from the perspective of the powerful. By listening to the marginalized, we can challenge those stories and get a more complete picture of the past.
So for you, the listener, what do we want you to think about after this deep dive into the world of white women and slavery? What's the takeaway?
I want you to think about this. How does knowing this hidden history change how you see slavery and its impact? It's not just about adding women to the story. It's about understanding the complexities of power, of complicity, how even those who were oppressed themselves could still be part of and even continue systems of oppression. It challenges us to think critically about how these systems work and what we can do to dismantle them.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much we think we know and how there's always more to learn.
Exactly. And, history isn't just facts and dates in a textbook. It's about how we interpret things, whose point of view we're hearing, the stories that get told, the voices that get amplified, or the ones that get silenced. That all shapes how we see the past.
Right. For so long, we haven't heard from the enslaved people themselves. But when we focus on their experiences, that's when we get a more accurate and complete understanding.
I agree. And it's not just about fixing the past. It's about understanding our present and making a better future. When we acknowledge the legacies of slavery and racism, then we can start to dismantle those systems and create a society that's fair for everyone.
So after this deep dive with you into the world of white women and slavery, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away thinking about? What's the so what of all this?
I want you to consider this. How does knowing this hidden history change your understanding of slavery and its impact? It's not just about adding women to the equation. It's about recognizing the complexities of power, complicity, and how even those who were oppressed themselves could participate in and perpetuate systems of oppression. It makes us think critically about how these systems work and how we can dismantle them.
That's a powerful point. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world, and that means confronting uncomfortable truths and challenging the narratives that have been used to justify injustice.
It also reminds us that history is not set in stone. It's a conversation that's always evolving, a process of constantly reinterpreting and understanding. We should never stop learning, questioning, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Well said. And for our listeners, if you want to explore this further, Dr. Jones Rogers' book, They Were Her Property, is a great place to start. It's really well researched and makes you think. It sheds light on this part of American history that we don't often talk about.
I totally agree. It's a must-read for anyone who doesn't understand slavery and its lasting impact on society.
It's a book that will stick with you. Well, there you have it, folks, a deep dive into the world of white women and slavery. We hope this conversation challenged what you thought you knew, made you curious, and left you with a deeper understanding of this complex and important part of American history.
And remember, learning never stops. There's always more to discover, more to understand, and more work to do to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
That's it for us today, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.